Welcome everyone to LR lesson number 7. Today's subject is going to be flexibility on LR. Just a note here, I am actually recording in a studio space today. I was just kind of out of the office, and so this is something that I had available to me today. So I'm using a really higher quality mic that's much closer to my face, so you will probably hear even more lip smacking and various kind of gross mouth noises. Apologies in advance, but again, being a studio space, I had to sort of record everything in one go, and this is the setup that I have, so yeah, apologies in advance. But moving right along. So what this lesson contains is another in the flexibility series, the meta series that I've been building across LG, RC, and finally I've added LR to the mix. And so how to practice LR in a manner that improves flexibility is what we'll be covering today. Specifically, the first thing to do is to develop a set of principles modeled on your orderly process of answering a question. And it's your orderly process. It's how you do things. If you don't have an orderly process of your own, or you do and you just haven't really thought it out, use untimed practice to develop one and kind of write it out and really think about how you do things. I will list out my personal set of principles that I use on the following slide, and I think it's pretty solid, but then again, that's me, and you know what works for me obviously may not work for you. Adjust it as you see fit according to your needs. The next thing to do is to discern what parts of your principled approach help you more. I personally find myself in my personal principle 4.2 all the time on more difficult questions, and it works for me. And the next thing for you to do is discern what parts of your principled approach fail on harder questions, and we mean hard for you. It doesn't matter what the metrics say, it doesn't matter how many people get it right or wrong. Things that challenge you are what we're looking at here. I personally find that principles 3 and 4.1 from my set of principles, they work great for me on easy and moderate questions, but every time I face a harder question of various types, principles 3 and 4.1, they never seem to get the job done for me. And so based on the above discernment, your goal is to develop a standard for judging when to bias away from spending too much time and energy in the principles that help you less, and bias yourself towards reaching the principles ASAP that you find more helpful. So kind of as I've said here, I find principle 4.2 generally more helpful on harder questions. So when I'm reading a stimulus and it's hard, I'm immediately leaning towards just getting to 4.2 as fast as possible. I may even skip the previous principles if it comes to that. You want to use untimed practice at first to fine-tune this, because as you're kind of seeing, this is a pretty deliberate process when it comes to building a principle set that works for you. Make a conscious effort to actually practice abandoning various stages of your analysis as soon as you can tell it's not going to pan out for you, and moving on to the next step. So that's really the goal here. Learn how to make that judgment call. That's how you move smoothly and fluidly between various parts of your process. And finally, kind of the catch-all thing that you need to remember when you're building this principled approach is to accept that even when you do all the above and you focus your efforts on what works best for you, even then you might be stumped. If you had an orderly process, you'll usually be able to recognize the workable answer choices, so if you won't be able to find necessarily the one correct answer right away, you'll at least get down to the last two answers, generally speaking, with a principled approach, and from there you can do that sort of last two answers thing. I'll try to remember to include a link to that particular workshop that I had on LR in the upper right here. Ultimately, the goal of this process is to get a pretty fluid process in place. It all looks super heavy and deliberate here in today's lesson because I'm explaining it step by step out loud, but in reality, many stages of my principled approach take mere seconds, and it'll be the same for you once you either adopt my approach or kind of customize it for yourself. Either way, it's going to turn out to be pretty similar, I think. So to give you the promised principles, I'll start with sort of a rapid overview. Principle number 1 is very familiar to anyone who's been following my content so far. It's old hat. Get hostile and stay hostile. Principle number 2 is to generalize. This should also be familiar to you guys if you've been following my content in LR to any meaningful extent. Principle number 3, the next in line, is that on easy assumption questions, I look for the P versus C disconnect first. On principle 4.1, which is the next step I would take if principle 3 doesn't pan out, and this is for moderate difficulty assumption questions, I look for a P versus P plus disconnect. Principle 4.2, which is again something that I would do if 3 and 4.1 didn't work out, also for moderate difficulty assumption questions, I try then to, if I can't find P versus C or P versus P plus, I default to looking for the general form of the assumption and negative space. And if all of this sounds a little bit weird to you, the rest of this stuff is in my LR playlist, which I will remember to link here for you guys if you need a refresher on what P versus C is, P versus P plus. That being said, I will also demonstrate it fairly clearly later on in the lesson, so don't worry too hard about that. And finally, for Principle 5, on the most difficult assumption family of questions, I question the premise's fundamental relevance, and this, as it sounds, is not really that easy to do. It kind of goes against what we're used to, so we'll discuss that in greater detail right here. So now that we've gone through that sort of lightning overview, I'll just kind of go through each principle bit by bit. Feel free to skip to the actual question if all of that was familiar and it doesn't really sound that foreign to you. But to get a little bit more explanation, let's start right up with Principle 1. So Principle 1 is to get hostile and stay hostile. The hostility that I'm talking about here is sort of a logical response. It really, I can boil it down to resisting the temptation to grant the arguer the same kind of academic authority that you've granted your teachers all your life. So basically, the most efficient way to learn in school so far has not been to sit there challenging every single little thing that you are told, but basically accept that what you're being told has been put through some sort of, quasi peer review process, and that you have been able to trust, for the most part, that what people are telling you is true, and you don't have to question it. Resist that temptation. That's something that's been inculcated in us all of our lives, but you have to resist it here. Your default position should not be, let's be constructive and interpret the data that we're given here so that it works. That's kind of how school, again, like I've just been saying, has socialized you to think in an academic setting. But that should not be your position here, because that kind of gives you the wrong instinct. It instinctively and intuitively makes you paper over imperfections in an argument, and that's disastrous in this section. Your default position, in contrast, should be, let's find out how this idiot has failed. Then we might do them the favor of fixing their bad argument. That is a much better position to be in. That will prevent you from doing what I just said happens when you don't fight your socialization, which is to just paper over errors, kind of ignore them, look for ways around them. And this is something that a lot of us do without even thinking. And so that's why this hostility concept is a very deliberate thing that I teach. You're trying to overcome the way you've been told to do things all your life. And ultimately, this sort of stance does allow you to detect the more subtle disconnects within arguments without, like I've been saying all along, instinctively giving them a pass. So Principle 1 is something that I do in general all the time, as is Principle 2. I generalize whenever possible on arguments. And this is very much a direct outgrowth of Principle 1. Academically and socially, it feels disrespectful to a degree. When we listen to someone embark on a big fancy argument, and then we dumb it down to, okay, so what you're actually saying is, believe conclusion C based on fact P. Cool story, bro. I mean, obviously, that little bit at the end is something that we don't often say out loud or even think explicitly, but that's kind of going to be the basis of how we are going to generalize arguments. As disrespectful as it feels, this dumbing down, this generalization, what that allows us to do is to gain immunity to the often deeply complicated sounding facts that are put in front of us in a stimulus, and instead focus on the relationship between those facts. So principles 1 and 2 that we just talked about they're broad-based. They apply to basically every single question type that you see. But principles 3, 4, and 5 that I'm about to cover here are really specifically designed to help me get through assumption-related questions. I believe Kaplan back in the day called them the assumption family of questions. I wouldn't be surprised if other test prep places had similar language. But there's that whole related family of questions that are based around assumptions, right? So assumptions, strength and weaken flaw. I would personally put a lot of the principal questions in there, as well as the paradox contradiction questions. But there's a whole family of questions that make up a pretty big bulk of the section that all kind of become susceptible to the next 3 principles. So starting with principle number 3, this is for the easiest / most doable questions. And so principle number 3 is where I am looking for a simple vocabulary mismatch, which I characterize as P versus C. The premises mention some distinct concept P, but the conclusion is all about some sort of distinct concept C. And so the assumption in an argument that's structured like this is any statement that properly links the concept P versus the concept C. This is the ideal scenario for assumption family of questions. It usually leads to quite clear paraphrases that are in turn honored by the correct answer. So all in all, it's the ideal. But of course, the ideal isn't always the case, and so for the more moderate to sort of lower end of the high difficulty questions, that's where I dip into principle 4. So principle 4, I split it into 2 parts, so we'll start with principle 4.1. That's where instead of a P versus C structure, I am looking for what I call a P versus P plus structure. Sometimes, instead of having a clear P versus C opposition spread across the premises and the conclusion, the logical disconnect is between premise 1 and premise 2. So again, in P versus C, there's a concept P in the premises and there's a concept C in the conclusion. That's a pretty clear divide. But sometimes the conclusion doesn't actually have such a clear divide against the premises, and so you'll be better off looking for something that's between the premises instead of between the premises and the conclusion. This shift in approach solves a lot of problems on a lot of moderate difficulty questions. And it has the added bonus of helping you avoid dealing with confusing or not very helpfully worded conclusions. And in a lot of ways, this P versus P plus approach very much simulates the Principle 3 outcome, in that the P versus P plus approach also lets you often formulate good prephrases. Not all the time, but it's usually pretty good. And so sometimes P versus P plus isn't enough, though, and that's where I find myself most often. So I mentioned on the sort of lightning review of my LR principles that 4.2 is where I usually find myself a lot for the harder questions. So we'll talk a little bit here about what that is and why I'm here a lot. So 4.2 is when I have tried P versus C and P versus P plus. Neither of them are really going to work out. That's when I default to this approach, which is to look for what I call the general form of the assumption, as well as do some negative space analysis. So the general form of an assumption is this. The premises P are alone, without outside help, enough to prove conclusion C. So as that sounds, that's not really a good prephrase. That's very general. It's very broad. It applies to a huge swath of arguments. But there is some utility to this, and we'll discuss what that is. So again, it's not really going to help you predict an answer choice on its own, but it kind of primes you in a way to start doing the important thing, which is what I consider negative space thinking. So what is negative space thinking, for those of you unfamiliar? Well, in a nutshell, negative space thinking is asking yourself a question like this. Is P really enough to prove C? Might P need some extra help to do the job? Might there be alternative explanations for C? These sorts of thoughts, to me, don't really come instinctively as I'm reading a stimulus, but once I throw the general form of the assumption up there in the front of my mind, these questions come more naturally. And so this departs drastically from Principles 3 and 4.1, but really that's okay. That's why I have a distinct principle for this. The point isn't to prephrase precisely as Principles 3 and 4.1 often lead us to do, but instead what we are doing with the general form of the assumption and the negative space analysis that follows. What we're doing is to prime ourselves to recognize the correct answer, even if we didn't predict it exactly ahead of time, by asking ourselves, what are the alternatives? Is P really enough to do it on its own? What might it have been nice to add to what we've already been given in order to make this all work better? Those considerations, even if they don't yield a specific prediction for an answer choice, they will at least open your mind to the possibility of, okay, I didn't see this coming, but I see how this might fit with some of my questions. So 4.1 and 4.2 put together, they help us circumvent language issues like what even is the main conclusion here? Because I'm sure all of you have experienced that at one point or another, where you're trying to do the normal breakdown of a stimulus. You're trying to find premises and trying to find the conclusion. And maybe you've come up with some sort of breakdown, but it's not exactly clear, which one is the main conclusion, which one's sort of a subsidiary conclusion or a sub-conclusion. And what is the premise? Is this a premise or is this just fluff? Sometimes that's hard to tell based on how things are written. But Principles 4.1 and 4.2 both kind of get around that by not really focusing so much on the premise versus conclusion distinction, but more so on the disconnects between a certain set of concepts in one part of the argument versus a certain set of concepts in another part of the argument. That's kind of the strength of putting 4.1 and 4.2 together. And finally, for our fifth principle, which is also related directly to the assumption family of questions. This is something that I reserve for the most difficult questions. Most of the time, this is just a necessary assumption kind of thing, but even in questions that aren't necessary assumptions, the most difficult ones may call for some of this sometimes. So what is principle number 5? Well, it sort of breaks the foundational rule of LR by calling into question the fundamental relevance of premises. Most of the time, we're okay with accepting the fundamental relevance of a premise, or basically the entire set of premises. What I mean by that is that even if an arguer leaves holes in their reasoning, we don't doubt our capacity to fix it. We don't doubt that the premises can be connected to the conclusion in some manner that isn't totally stupid. And so in an argument where so as an example, in an argument where P equals reading nutrition labels and C equals better health outcomes, we still believe that P has something to do with C and that we can make it work, even if the arguer failed to do that themselves. We're not going to just, immediately question whether or not nutrition labels even have the possibility of applying to better health outcomes. And we're just going to believe that that's something that can be done. However, on the most difficult LR questions, again, usually necessary assumption questions, we are asked to doubt even this fundamental relevance. This is almost exclusively reserved, as I've been saying, for necessary assumption questions, but this level of difficulty can quite rarely leak out into other types as well. And so an example of how that would apply to the nutrition label and health outcome situation, the example that I just provided on the slide, in a necessary assumption question, we would sit there questioning whether or not nutrition labels have anything to do with health, like period. For those of us who have grown up in the West, which should be most of you, because, or at least a modernized society that's kind of imitating the West, you kind of know what a health label is, right? It tells you how much fat's in there, how many calories, how much sugar, vitamins, that kind of stuff, right? It's not weird for us to assume as a baseline that that kind of information is, in fact, possible to have an impact on somebody's health decisions, right? But in a necessary assumption question, or in any question that calls upon principle 5, that's going to be up for grabs. We are going to be like, well, maybe nutrition labels don't even have health information on them, which of course sounds ridiculous to anyone who's seen a nutrition label. But that's the kind of challenge that necessary assumption questions have. We are questioning the fundamental capability of a premise to apply to a conclusion. And so that kind of covers all 5 principles. I don't really have anything more specific. What you might have noticed, though, is that there are other question types, right? The assumption questions aren't everything. There's all sorts of miscellaneous kinds. Parallel reasoning and parallel flaw are the first, the 2 big ones that come to mind. But there's a whole bunch of others, right? And so my response is, sorry. If you're looking for principles, I don't have any more for those. But I'm also not sorry because of what I'll discuss right here. For even the notorious parallel reasoning and parallel flaw types, principles 1 and 2 will give you enough room to use the rest of your LR skills to win. And so the reason why I don't have any set of specific principles for those miscellaneous types is because, generally speaking, only the assumption family of questions really require that specialized principle 3, 4.1, 4.2, and principle 5 approach. The rest of them, even if they can be kind of hard at times because they're written weirdly, principles 1 and 2 more or less aren't enough for most people to kind of figure out how to do it on your own after that. And so as an example, aside from the parallel reasoning, parallel flaw, method of argument questions, those are almost 100% susceptible to principle 2. When you end up generalizing a method of argument stimulus, you'll see that, okay, piece A relates to piece B in this way, and that relates to conclusion C at the end. And seeing the relationship between those 3 pieces is going to be basically the answer choice for any method of argument question. Similarly, point and issue questions are similarly susceptible. If 2 people are having a disagreement, and you're trying to find out what that disagreement is, breaking each of their arguments down, dumbing them down, seeing how the pieces relate to each other will make it pretty obvious, without too much difficulty, where the disagreement and where the disconnects actually are. And the story is basically the same for all the other miscellaneous types. Being able to break down the argument into more digestible, dumbed down pieces will give you more room to get it right by using your own innate logical tools and not really concerning yourself with super explicit approaches. And so now that we've gone over the general overview, today's question that we're going to be demonstrating flexibility on is from Prep Test 23, Section 3, question number 3. As you might guess from how early it is in this section, I think this is actually a fairly easy question, all things considered. I'm not sure what the metrics say, so I didn't look at 7 Sage or anything. I don't know what the percentages are, but I'm just going to say that it is fairly easy based on my experience of the question itself. Nonetheless, despite it being easy, I think it offers ample opportunity to show how I move through my set of principles and make judgment calls. Moreover, it has the added benefit of me wanting to keep the focus on the question itself. And so if the question is not really going to be that hard, that helps, right? And I want to keep the focus more on the process of trying things but moving on when it doesn't work out, i.e. flexibility, the whole point of this lesson. And also my secondary goal of keeping my video run times a little bit lower. That's not going to stop me from putting up like hour-plus videos when the situation calls for it. But I didn't think that spending way too long discussing and demonstrating flexibility was really the best thing to do. So that's my sort of secondary goal here. Now, there is actually a pretty notorious question, question number 10, later on in this section. Again, don't have the metrics in my head offhand, but it's still pretty rough. So if you guys want to see a demonstration of flexibility on that one or any other one that you found personally hard, let me know. As usual, my inbox is open to you guys. I'm not afraid of at all. Actually, I quite enjoy doing individualized email explanations, or giving you guys a free consultation, 20 minutes to talk about a question, something like that. Or if enough people ask me about it, I'll just make another video, as I have done in the past. So yeah, talk to me if there's more questions that you would like to see a demonstration of this process on. But to get into the question itself now. So as we always do here on the channel, I'll start my breakdown of the stimulus with the premises. And so I see 3 of them here. Premise number 1 is that Amy bought a pot-bellied pig at the pet store in Springfield. Premise number 2 is that Springfield Code classifies pigs as livestock. And premise number 3 is that people are not allowed to keep livestock in Springfield. So that's all I see in terms of the premises that this argument is based on. As for the conclusion, our conclusion is that a city official says that Amy cannot keep the pig as a pet. So yeah, sure, we do have 3 premises, and that does seem a little bit higher than normal. Usually it's just 1 or 2 premises, but all told, it seems pretty solid here. So principle 1, starting right at the beginning of my list, this is only going to be indirectly helpful here, and that's usually how it is. Now, the city official's conclusion does sound pretty watertight, which is unusual. As hostile as I want to be, I can't really find why. It doesn't really jump out to me. Now, my hostility, though, at least serves as a constant reminder in the back of my head that something is amiss. But the hostility itself does little to reveal what that something is. I'm just going to be constantly taking the attitude of there's something to find here, there's something wrong with it, but even if I don't know what it is, I'm at least keyed into that possibility. But because this is only indirectly helpful and something that I always do kind of passively anyway, I'm not going to dwell any further on. I'm just going to move along immediately to premise 2, see if that helps. Unfortunately for us, though, premise 2 is quite pointless here, and that is because this is all pretty straightforward. We know what the law says about pigs and the people who want to keep them. It's pretty clear that you can't keep pigs in Springfield because pigs are livestock, not allowed to keep livestock. So I don't really know what else to dumb down about this. It's all very straightforward. So again, just like principle 1, it's not going to do much for me, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Going to move along to principle 3. Unfortunately for me, though, principle 3 may also prove unfruitful here. And the reason I say this is because if we're looking for a P versus C, maybe we can say that the keep as a pet part from the conclusion is distinct from the general keep that's discussed in the law in premise 3. But when you look at it, I sincerely doubt that this is going to be enough. Not only is this a necessary assumption question and will therefore require a deeper dive, but arguably the prohibition against general keeping in premise 3 would also include keeping as a pet from the conclusion. So, the generalized term keeping probably includes the prohibition of keeping things as pets, so I don't really think this P versus C possibility is going to go anywhere. So principle 3 is a bust. Let's move on to principle 4.1. But just based on what I've seen from my principle 3 work, I'm beginning to have doubts that 4.1 is going to do anything for us here either. If we're looking for a P versus a P plus, so let's say, okay, fine, we didn't find a disconnect with the conclusion. Let's see if there's any disconnects in the premises. Maybe we can say that the pot-bellied part from pot-bellied pig in premise 1 is distinct from the general pig that's mentioned in premise 2. All pigs basically are classified as livestock according to principle 2. I even more sincerely doubt that this is going to be enough. And again, just like last time, not only is this an necessary assumption question, and therefore requires deeper dives for the most part, but also the classification of pigs as livestock under the law would also apply to pot-bellied pigs, right? Just kind of like I saw the general term keeping last time probably includes keeping things as pets. The general classification pig here probably includes pot-bellied pigs, because pig is just the general term. If you mean pig, that means every single kind of pig, presumably, right? And so a specific subclass of pigs would probably arguably fall under the general pig in premise 2. And so that leads me to race to principle 4.2, and that's actually how I did the question myself. In practice, I raced here as soon as I could. Even though I didn't know for sure, I got the feeling just based on my breakdown of the argument, because nothing jumped out at me in principles 1 or principle 2, because I couldn't dumb it down any further, and because I couldn't really, find anything obviously wrong with it, I had my suspicions that principle 3 and 4.1 wouldn't work. And so yeah, principles 1 and 2 happen without conscious effort for me. So those are, I didn't even really stop to do those. Those are just realizations that I had as I was breaking down the stimulus. And based on that, I was able to judge quickly when to abandon 3 and 4.1, which was almost immediately. I made a token effort to find those disconnects, but I didn't really spend any meaningful time, dwelling on their failure. So let's see where principle 4.2 brings us. Let's start with the general form of the assumption, which is our arguer, the city official, believes that the premises, Springfield laws, are enough without any additional considerations to prove the conclusion, which is Amy can't keep the pig. So our arguer believes that the premises are enough to prove the conclusion. Yay. That's not really going to help us with a preface, right? But let's see if this helps us with negative space thinking at all. So in terms of negative space, are those laws really enough to prove that Amy can't keep the pig? Sadly, though, I couldn't think of anything concrete here in response to that. My answer seemed to be yes. It seems pretty clear. Pigs of all kinds seem to be livestock, and livestock of all kinds aren't allowed to be kept in Springfield. So that seems like a pretty open and shut case to me. And this open and shut nature, this sort of coherence, this is a sign that the argument is actually pretty coherent overall. So we're likely going to need to look outside the boundaries of what's been written out when it comes to questioning the ability of this arguer to prove their point. So I'm going to be deeply suspicious of answers that try to introduce useless excuses about what is or what is not livestock, or what is or is not a pet. We already know pigs are livestock, and keeping livestock is not allowed, period. So solving Amy's problem with keeping the pig will have to upend the calculus in some other way that doesn't have to do with these very clear classifications that we know just are guaranteed to apply here. So the only thing that I was able to get out of, principle 4.2 that I can add to the page here is our general form of the assumption for what it's worth. Spoiler alert, it's not going to be worth very much. But again, the only assumption that I can come up with was that the laws are, without additional facts, enough to prove that Amy can't keep the pig. And so we did principle 4.2 on the last slide, principle 5 now. Honestly, I didn't even try anything with principle 5 here, even though this was a necessary assumption question. And the reason why I didn't even try principle 5 was that without better negative space thoughts, I couldn't think of ways to predict any specific challenges to the relevance of any of the premises. So I'm just going to head into the answer choices of what I did get out of 4.2, which is the understanding that the laws sound pretty complete, and thus we are going to probably have to look outside the laws themselves to find out what this arguer assumed. And so with that, I'm going to move into the answer choices as promised. So starting with the very first one, answer choice A. Oh, this is probably it. I didn't even think to question whether or not Amy was even subject to the jurisdiction of Springfield at all. If you did, awesome. I mean, in retrospect, the general form of the assumption that I have up here on the page does suggest that the laws need to apply to Amy for all this to work, but that's just not where my head went, which is slightly embarrassing for someone who graduated from law school and took a civil procedure course, because basically in any civil case, or actually really a criminal case as well, jurisdiction is the very first question that any attorney should ask themselves. So there's a court, there's a prosecutor, there's somebody who says, hey, I want to drag your client into court because such and such law was broken, or such and such offense occurred, such and such civil offense happened, that sort of thing. And the first question you need to ask if a client asks you for help is hey, are these people who are trying to bully you into court, do they even have the right to do that? Do these laws even apply to you? Are you a citizen of the state? Did what happened happen in the state? Does the state have enough of an interest to say that, hey, the Illinois State Court wants you, an Indiana citizen, to show up and answer for what you've done? That's something that an attorney should do, but in the context of the exam, it's just not what I saw here. So really, it looks like this answer choice doesn't just question the relevance of a single premise, it questions the relevance of every premise. None of it matters at all if Amy isn't going to do the pig keeping outside of Springfield. So if you didn't see the correctness of A as instantly as I did, pretty much as soon as I read A, I was like, oh man, this is it. A quick negation test, the thing that we do on necessary assumption questions, should confirm that A is indeed the answer. So if we negate A, if Amy doesn't live in Springfield, maybe she lives in a place that allows her to keep the pig, regardless of what Springfield does to its own citizens regarding pigs and livestock and all that. And so yeah, if Amy doesn't live in Springfield and she's not going to keep the pig in Springfield, none of the Springfield code really applies, right? So I selected A at this point, and I was pretty confident. But I checked the others as rapidly as I could. Note that I wouldn't have bothered to eliminate the others if I took much longer than I did to reach answer choice A as the correct one. So starting with answer choice B, this is a pretty easy elimination. If we negate this, we get pigs are classified as pets in Springfield. So not only does this directly contradict premise 2 on its face, but even if it's true, it now introduces a battle of the classifications that we have no way of deciding. So premise 2 tells us pigs are livestock, but if answer choice B, if we negate it, tells us that pigs are pets, pet versus, well, what happens in cases where animals are both pets and livestock? Is that even possible? Even if it's possible, does that mean that you get to keep the pig even though it's technically livestock? There's too many unknowns here, and so there's no way of knowing that B has any sort of relevance totally. Answer choice C is even more irrelevant, so we eliminate it. It doesn't matter what the law says about non-livestock. Amy's problem is that her pig is considered livestock, and that's the whole problem that the city official has with Amy's keeping of the pig. So it doesn't really matter what the law says about things that aren't livestock. D is also elimination. It's very similar to C. It's irrelevant. It's just about dogs and cats, which again, our problem is with pigs. It doesn't really matter. And finally, answer choice E, we also eliminate this because it is also irrelevant. There was absolutely no consideration for the role of the pet store. The laws didn't care about where you got the animal from. If it's livestock, you can't keep it in Springfield, period, end of story. So this is barking up the wrong tree entirely. So what are the takeaways from this very simple question that we just kind of raced through? The first is to develop a sense of where your strengths are on various question types. That's how all of this principled approach stuff works, and that's how flexibility works. I personally do well with Principle 4.2 and Principle 5, which is something that I mentioned at the very beginning, unnecessary assumption questions. So when faced with that question type, my inclination is to race to that stage, that 4.2 and 5 stage, as soon as I can. If I'm super confident or super rushed, sometimes I'll even skip right to that stage because I don't stop in to do Principle 3 and Principle 4.1. But if I'm playing it safe, as I kind of did on this question, the compromise is to do that Principle 3 work and the Principle 4.1 work, but do it fast and make the call early if I don't think it's going to be fruitful, as I did here. Similarly, I know that sometimes even my Principle 4.2 work and my Principle 5 work, it doesn't pan out. Instead of panicking, I just accept that and move into answer choices, which hopefully I demonstrated fairly clearly today here. And when it comes to this question, I was very fortunate that A happened to be the right answer, and I recognized it as such, and thus could have saved time and skip checking all the other answers. But as for eliminating the others, that was less fortune and a bit more procedure. While my Principle 3, 4.1, or 4.2 work didn't yield any prephases for me that pointed me towards A directly, I nonetheless discovered how coherent the argument was, and that is important. It really did look like Amy was out of luck. It looked like the law was pretty airtight, the legal situation. So answers like pigs aren't classified as pets or non-livestock animals can be kept, that clearly didn't solve the problem, so I wasn't tempted away from the correct answer on that. So even if we don't get a prephrase, if you do principled approaches, generally speaking, you will get some yield out of them one way or the other. So hopefully that all kind of put together shows you what flexibility looks like for me on a fairly easy question, but also don't discount the discussion that we just had here and also at the very beginning of the presentation, which is about how you guys can build your own coherent principled approaches that lead to a lot of flexibility. So if you've reached this point, thank you for watching. As always, like and subscribe, do all that algorithm stuff. It helps grow the channel, helping grow the channel. Of course, it helps me, but again, I'm not doing this to blow up on YouTube or anything. This is like the worst possible niche I can think of to do that. But really, I want to do this to grow as an instructor and reach more students. So leave a comment if you want to, but I see that a lot of you guys don't really prefer doing that. Most of you seem to prefer emailing me, so again, here's my email address. You can also find it in the contact area of the channel. shycity180@gmail.com if you have any further questions. Especially I encourage any of you who have questions about, okay, so great, you did an easy question here, but what about those harder ones? Well, my email inbox is completely open to you. Feel free to throw any question at me and I will get back to you about it. If email isn't the best format for it, I'll talk to you, I'll email you back, and we'll set up a time to maybe do a free consultation to discuss your issues. But yeah, I will see you guys in the next one.